Please let him be happy, even if that happiness never includes me." The words were so soft that Duke Harrison Vale almost mistook them for the wind. Briar Fall Hall had a way of turning every sound into sorrow after midnight. The old house stood on the cliffs above Cape Alder, Maine, its gray stone walls facing the Atlantic like a proud widow refusing to bow. Outside, the January fog pressed against the tall windows, and the sea beat itself against the rocks far below with a patience that felt almost cruel. Harrison had been returning from the Western study, where estate ledgers and harbor contracts had kept him awake long after the servants had vanished to their narrow beds. A storm was moving in from the coast. He could smell salt in the corridors and hear the faint complaint of old beams settling under the weight of cold air. He had meant only to pass the chapel door. He had meant only to reach his chambers, pour a measure of brandy, and forget, for a few hours, the woman who slept under his roof and bore his name. Then he heard her voice. Grace Vale, the bride he had resented for 1 full year, was kneeling inside the private chapel with her head bowed beneath a white wool shawl. 3 candles burned before her, their flames trembling in the draught that slipped through the stone seams. 1 candle stood beneath the small portrait of his mother, whose gentle face had watched over the chapel since his boyhood. 1 burned before the silver cross that had belonged to the Vale family for 4 generations. The 3rd stood alone, its light thin and stubborn, as if fighting not to be swallowed by the dark. Harrison's gloved hand closed around the brass doorframe. He should have left. A husband who had made indifference his law had no right to witness his wife's prayers. Yet he remained motionless, hidden by the shadowed arch, while Grace whispered as though speaking to a god who was the only one in Briar Fall Hall willing to listen. "Let him find peace," she said. "Let the old grief release him. Let him be loved properly someday, by someone who does not remind him of a duty he never wanted." Harrison's breath caught before he could stop it. She did not ask to be loved. She did not ask that he soften, or turn toward her, or regret the cold dinners, the separate rooms, the careful silences that had grown between them like frost over glass. She prayed for his happiness with the calm dignity of someone who had already accepted that she might never be part of it. The candlelight touched her face then, revealing the pale exhaustion beneath her composure. She looked younger than 24 in that moment, and far lonelier than any duchess should have looked in a house filled with servants, portraits, silver, and locked rooms. Harrison had told himself for 12 months that Grace Ellison had married him for safety, for position, for the protection of the Vale name after her own family's fortune had thinned to almost nothing. He had told himself that her quietness was calculation, that her obedience was strategy, that her kindness to the household was the polished performance of a woman determined to become indispensable. It had been easier to believe that. Crueler, perhaps, but easier. A selfish wife could be ignored. A gentle one was a judgment. Grace folded her hands tighter. On the chapel floor beside her lay a folded handkerchief embroidered with his initials, H.V., the silver thread catching the candlelight in small, broken flashes. Harrison recognized it at once. He had seen it once before, fallen beneath her chair after Lady Maribel Crane had humiliated her at supper. He had picked it up and kept it without understanding why. Now another lay beside her knees, newly stitched, as if she had made more than one and never dared offer them. "If I have made his life heavier," Grace continued, her voice trembling only once, "then teach me how to carry my place without bitterness. Teach me how to love him silently, without asking anything in return." Something inside Harrison shifted. Not broke. Not yet. But shifted, like ice cracking beneath a man who had spent years believing the lake was solid. He remembered their wedding day with a sharpness that made his jaw tighten. The church in Portland had been full of winter light, cold and white across the marble aisle. Grace had walked toward him in her mother's altered gown, her hands steady around a small bouquet of white roses. He had looked at her and seen not a bride, but a sentence passed upon him by families, lawyers, and a dead father's will. Later, in the carriage, while snow touched the glass in delicate, accusing flakes, he had said, "Do not mistake this arrangement for affection." She had turned her face toward the window before answering, I would never demand what was not freely given. At the time, he had taken her composure for pride. Now, standing outside the chapel, listening to her pray for the happiness of the man who had denied her even simple tenderness, he wondered whether he had mistaken courage for coldness because recognizing her pain would have required him to recognize his own cruelty. Grace bowed lower. The sea thundered beneath the cliffs. The candles bent but did not go out. Harrison remained in the dark, unable to enter, unable to leave, while the wife he had never truly seen offered his wounded heart to heaven as if it were something precious, and for the first time in a year, the Duke of Briarfall Hall felt ashamed of how quietly he had been loved. He did not sleep after hearing her prayer. Long before dawn softened the windows of Briarfall Hall, Harrison Vale stood alone in the western study with the fire burning low, and the ledgers untouched before him. The house was silent, but it was no longer the comfortable silence he had chosen. It had changed shape. It had become a witness. Every corridor seemed to remember the sound of Grace's voice in the chapel. Every dark pane of glass reflected the image of her kneeling on the stone floor, asking nothing for herself. He tried to dismiss it as sentiment. A tired woman's midnight weakness. A performance meant for no audience, and therefore impossible to accuse. That was what made it unbearable. She had not known he was there. Her kindness had not been arranged for him to see. It had existed without him, quietly, faithfully, like a lamp left burning in a room he had refused to enter. By breakfast, a thin silver rain had begun to fall over Cape Alder, blurring the cliffs and turning the Atlantic into a sheet of restless iron. Harrison entered the dining room at precisely 8, as he always did on Thursdays, and found Grace already seated at the far end of the long mahogany table. Between them stretched polished wood, white china, a bowl of pears, and one full year of things unsaid. She wore a dove-gray morning dress with a narrow collar, her dark blonde hair pinned neatly at the nape of her neck. There was no sign on her face that she had spent part of the night in prayer. No accusation. No plea. No trace of the soft trembling he had heard when she asked heaven to make him happy. "Good morning, Your Grace," she said, lowering her eyes with practiced calm. The title struck him strangely. She had called him that since the second week of their marriage, after he had once corrected her for using his Christian name in front of a visiting solicitor. He had forgotten the moment almost instantly. Apparently she had not. "Good morning," he replied. The words sounded unfamiliar in his own mouth, as if he had borrowed them from a kinder man. A footman poured coffee. Silver touched porcelain with a delicate sound. Grace unfolded her napkin and began to eat as though this breakfast were no different from the hundreds before it, as though her husband had not stood outside a chapel door and discovered that her silence contained more mercy than his pride could bear. Harrison watched her hands. They were slim, pale, and carefully composed, but the skin near her knuckles was faintly reddened from cold. He remembered the East greenhouse, the one his mother had loved, and how he had once noticed fresh soil on Grace's cuffs but had chosen not to ask. "You were awake late," he said at last. Grace's knife paused only a fraction of an inch above the toast. "I often am. I did not know that." Her mouth softened, not into a smile, but into something sadder. "There are many things in this house Your Grace does not need to know." The sentence was not cruel. That made it sharper. Harrison looked down at his coffee, black and untouched. He had wanted, absurdly, to mention the chapel, to ask why she had prayed for him, to demand an explanation for a tenderness he had not earned. But the distance between them had not appeared overnight. He had built it carefully, stone by stone, with indifference disguised as dignity. A man could not wall a woman away for a year, and then resent the quietness of the room where he had left her. The rain thickened against the windows. Beyond the glass, the grounds of Briarfall sloped toward the dark pines and the cliff road, where carriages often arrived bearing merchants, attorneys, and relatives with opinions. Harrison remembered the first time Grace had arrived there, not as a guest, but as his wife. The house had been washed in late winter light, its towers dimmed by fog, its entrance hall smelling faintly of beeswax and old roses. He had stood at the bottom of the staircase while the servants lined the walls, and he had watched her remove her gloves with calm fingers. She had been 23 then, wearing the same white roses from the wedding pin near her collar. He had offered no welcome, no arm, no warmth. Only the rules. Separate rooms. Separate correspondence. Public courtesy. Private distance. Grace had listened without interrupting, her face pale but composed, and when he finished, she had said, "I understand." How easily he had believed that understanding meant agreement. How easily he had mistaken survival for consent. Across the breakfast table, Grace lifted her teacup. The morning light touched the thin gold band on her finger. His ring. His name. His house. His neglect. Harrison suddenly remembered the carriage after the ceremony, the snow collecting along the window frame, the way she had folded her bouquet in her lap as if it were something fragile she had been entrusted to protect. "Do not mistake this arrangement for affection," he had told her then, each word polished and merciless. She had not cried. He had almost hated her for that. "I would never demand what was not freely given," she had answered. At the time, he had thought her proud. Now he wondered what it had cost her to say it. Grace set down her cup and rose. "If you will excuse me, I promised Mrs. Bell I would review the pantry accounts before noon." It was the sort of small duty he had never assigned her, and never thanked her for performing. Harrison stood because old manners moved faster than new remorse. Grace seemed surprised by the gesture, and that surprise unsettled him more than tears would have. She curtsied lightly and turned toward the door. "Grace," he said. She stopped. The name hung between them, too intimate after so much formality. Slowly she looked back. Harrison had spoken her name as a husband should, yet he had no idea what to do with the tenderness it required. "The rain is cold," he said, hating the poverty of the words. "Take the warmer shawl if you go to the lower rooms." For one heartbeat, her composure faltered. Not greatly. Only enough for him to see the woman beneath the Duchess, the lonely bride beneath the careful Grace. "Thank you," she said. Then she left him alone with the long table, the cooling coffee, and the terrible realization that this was perhaps the first kindness he had offered her in a year. The warmer shawl remained folded over Grace's arm for most of the morning, though the lower rooms of Briar Fall Hall were colder than the cliffs outside. She carried it with her through the pantry, the laundry passage, and the narrow servant's stair, not because she needed it, but because Harrison had told her to take it. Such a small sentence should not have mattered. It should not have warmed any part of her. Yet all morning, she felt it near her like a candle cupped against the wind. By noon, the rain had settled into a steady gray curtain over Cape Alder, blurring the line between sea and sky until the world beyond the windows looked unfinished. Grace sat in the housekeeper's office with Mrs. Bell, reviewing flour orders, coal deliveries, and the rising cost of repairs for the fishermen's cottages below the East Ridge. Her handwriting moved neatly across the ledger, delicate and exact. No one watching her would have guessed that one word from her husband had followed her through every corridor. Grace. He had said it as if the name belonged in his mouth, and for one dangerous moment she had wanted to believe it did. "Your Grace," Mrs. Bell said gently, "you have added the same column twice." Grace looked down. The numbers had blurred. "So I have." The older woman pretended not to notice the color rising in her cheeks. That was one of the mercies of Briar Fall Hall. Its servants saw everything and spoke only when kindness required it. "The Duke was at breakfast this morning?" Mrs. Bell asked, far too casually. "He usually is on Thursdays." "And he spoke?" Grace lowered her eyes to the ledger. "He mentioned the weather." Mrs. Bell's expression changed, but she said nothing. In a house where silence had become the family crest, even a comment about rain could feel like a door opening by 1 inch. Across the hall, unseen by either woman, Harrison stood outside the half-closed office door. He had come to ask about a misplaced invoice. That was what he told himself. Yet his hand remained still at his side, as he listened to the soft scratch of Grace's pen and the quiet authority in her voice as she discussed the coal stores for families who lived 3 miles down the coastal road. "The Martins have 3 children," she said. "Their roof still leaks near the stove. Send the extra lumber before Friday. Put it under household preservation if Mr. Clark objects. Mr. Clark always objects when generosity has a price," Mrs. Bell replied. "Then do not call it generosity," Grace said. "Call it preventing a larger expense after the next storm." Harrison almost smiled. Almost. He had never heard that tone from her, calm as folded linen, firm as iron beneath lace. In the dining room, she seemed made of restraint. Here, among ledgers and practical needs, she was something else entirely. Not timid. Not ornamental. Necessary. The word unsettled him. He stepped away before he could be discovered and walked toward the western study, but the house had begun to betray him. Everywhere he went, Grace appeared in evidence. In the entrance hall, a bowl of dried lavender had replaced the old sour smell of rain-soaked wool. In the library, the cracked globe had been repaired so precisely the seam was almost invisible. In the east corridor, a portrait of his mother had been cleaned of candle smoke, her painted eyes brighter than he remembered. He had thought Briarfall had simply endured the year. Now he realized it had been tended. Not by him. By her. The knowledge drew him, unwillingly, toward the sealed conservatory at the back of the house. His mother had loved that glass room when he was a boy. In spring she had filled it with white roses and lemon trees, though the Maine weather fought her at every turn. After her death, Harrison had locked the place and ordered it left alone. Grief had made him territorial, as if neglect could preserve what love had lost. But the door was not locked now. A faint warmth slipped through the frame, carrying the scent of damp soil and growing things. Harrison pushed it open. Inside, the conservatory lived. Not grandly, not fully, but bravely. Clay pots lined the stone floor. New panes of glass shone among old ones. Small green shoots rose from careful rows, and near the far wall, beneath a repaired window, stood 3 young white rose bushes. Grace was there, kneeling with her sleeves pinned back, gently pressing soil around the roots. The warmer shawl he had mentioned lay on a chair nearby, unused but kept close. For a moment, Harrison could not speak. The room struck him with memories so tender he had trained himself to hate them. His mother laughing as rain tapped the glass. His own boyish hands overfilled with clipped stems. White petals floating in a blue bowl beside her bed during her last winter. Grace looked up and froze. A small smear of soil marked her wrist. "Forgive me," she said quickly, rising. "I should have asked permission before reopening it." Permission. The word cut more deeply than accusation. Harrison looked at the rose bushes, then at the woman who had brought life into a room he had abandoned to dust. "Why did you?" he asked. Grace folded her hands, hiding the soil on her fingers. "Because the house seemed to miss it." He waited for more, for some mention of credit, of loneliness, of all he had failed to notice. None came. She only glanced toward the roses with a tenderness that did not ask to be rewarded. "Your mother wrote that this was the only room where winter felt less powerful." Harrison felt the old defensive cold rise within him, but it no longer fit as easily as before. "You read her journals?" Grace paled. "Only the ones left in the east sitting room. I thought they were household records at first. When I realized what they were, I should have stopped. But you did not." "No," she admitted softly. "I wanted to understand what this house had loved before it became so quiet." The rain whispered over the glass roof. Harrison looked at her then, truly looked, and saw not an intruder wearing his name, but a lonely young woman trying to speak to a family through the objects they had left behind. He had hated her for entering his life without invitation. Yet she had spent a year asking permission from ghosts. Grace reached for the shawl at last. "I will leave the room if you prefer it closed again." Harrison's reply came slowly, roughened by something he refused to call grief. "No," she stilled. He looked at the small white roses, fighting for root in the coastal winter, and then at the wife who had planted them in secret. Leave it open. Grace did not tell anyone that the Duke had allowed the conservatory to remain open. By evening, the news had traveled through Briarfall Hall without her help. Houses like Briarfall had veins. A footman noticed the Duke leaving the glass room without anger. A maid found the key still in the lock instead of returned to the iron ring. Mrs. Bell saw Grace come upstairs with soil on her cuffs and a look on her face she tried very hard to hide. By supper, even the kitchen fire seemed to burn with a different kind of curiosity. Harrison felt it the moment he entered the dining room. The servants moved as quietly as ever, but their silence had changed. It was no longer the silence of fear. It was expectation. Grace stood near the window, watching the rain slide down the glass and silver threads. She had changed into a dark blue dress with a modest collar and cuffs of old lace, simple enough for a private meal, dignified enough for a duchess who had long ago learned never to appear wounded in public. The candlelight softened her face, yet Harrison saw the weariness at the corners of her eyes. He wondered how many evenings she had stood in that exact place while waiting for a husband who came only because the calendar required it. "Your Grace?" she said, curtsying. Not Harrison. Not yet. He deserved that distance. He took his seat across from her, though for the first time the length of the table appeared absurd. It had been built for banquets, for visiting judges and shipping men and winter dinners with neighbors from 20 miles along the coast. Between a husband and wife, it felt like punishment made of polished mahogany. Soup was served. Rain tapped at the windows. Far below the cliffs, the tide struck the rocks with a slow, heavy rhythm. Grace lifted her spoon. Harrison did not. "The conservatory is warmer than I remembered," he said. Her hand paused. "I had the cracked flue repaired last month. The old heating pipe was still sound. You paid for it from the household account?" She looked down. "No." The answer was quiet enough that he almost missed it. "From where then?" Grace placed the spoon aside with care. "I sold the pearl combs my aunt gave me before the wedding. They were beautiful, but not useful." A strange pressure gathered beneath Harrison's ribs. He remembered those combs. She had worn them at a reception in Portland 6 months after their marriage, when society had gathered to inspect the unwanted Duchess of Briarfall. He had noticed the pearls then only because Lady Maribel Crane had laughed that they were too fine for a bride who looked as if she expected to be returned to her family by morning. Harrison had heard the remark. He had done nothing. "You should have asked me," he said. Grace met his eyes, and for the first time there was no softness to protect him from the truth. "I did once." The room seemed to still. Even the footman by the sideboard lowered his gaze. Harrison remembered nothing. That was the shame of it. Cruel words could be regretted. Forgotten neglect was harder to face, because it proved how little attention he had paid. "When?" he asked. Grace folded her hands in her lap. "Last May. I sent a note to your study requesting permission to reopen the East Glass Room. Your secretary returned it with your answer." "What answer?" "His Grace does not wish the dead disturbed." The sentence moved through the candlelight like cold smoke. Harrison shut his eyes briefly. He had not written it himself. He must have spoken it while reading correspondence, dismissing the matter without imagining the hands that would receive the message. The dead. His mother. His grief. Her hope. All of it reduced to a line of frost. "Grace," he began, but she rose before he could continue. "Please do not apologize for words that were only honest at the time. They were not honest." His voice was low. "They were careless." She looked at him then with an expression that made him feel both seen and refused. "Carelessness is sometimes more difficult to forgive." Then the dining room doors opened, and Mr. Clark, the estate manager, entered with a stack of papers pressed to his chest. He was a narrow man with pale eyes and a habit of bowing too deeply to Harrison, while barely inclining his head to Grace. "Forgive the interruption, Your Grace," he said to Harrison. "The harbor repair contracts require your signature tonight." He placed the documents beside Harrison's plate without looking at Grace. Several charitable disbursements have also been delayed, as they appear excessive. Grace's face changed almost imperceptibly. Those disbursements were approved for the lower cottages after the October storm. Mr. Clark gave a thin smile. With respect, Your Grace, household sympathy is not estate policy. Harrison watched Grace absorb the insult in silence. He saw the way her fingers tightened once against her skirt, and then released. A year ago, he would have allowed the exchange to pass. A week ago, perhaps. But the chapel prayer still lived inside him, and the white roses had opened a door he could not close. Mr. Clark, Harrison said. The room cooled around his voice. When the Duchess of Briarfall gives an instruction concerning this household or the families under its protection, it is estate policy. Grace turned toward him, startled. Mr. Clark's smile vanished. Of course, Your Grace. I only meant to preserve order. Then begin by remembering the order of this house. Harrison picked up the papers and set them aside without signing. You will bring the full accounts to the library tomorrow morning. The Duchess will attend. Mr. Clark bowed stiffly and withdrew. The doors closed. The rain continued. Grace stood very still, as if she had learned not to trust sudden shelter. Harrison looked at her across the candlelit room and understood, with a quiet pain that humbled him, that defending her once did not erase a year of leaving her undefended. You should not have had to hear that in your own home, he said. Grace's answer came after a long silence. No, she said softly. I should not have. The library at Briarfall Hall had never seemed smaller than it did the next morning. Its shelves rose 2 stories toward a ceiling darkened by age, and its windows looked east toward the restless Atlantic, yet when Grace entered at 9 o'clock, the room felt as narrow as a courtroom. Harrison stood beside the long oak table with his hands clasped behind his back. Mr. Clark was already there, his account books stacked in precise towers, his expression carefully wounded, as though being asked to explain himself were an injury. Grace wore a high-necked dress of deep green wool and carried a leather folder against her chest. She had slept poorly, not from fear of the meeting, but from the memory of Harrison's voice at supper. When the Duchess of Briarfall gives an instruction, it is estate policy. The words had followed her through the night like footsteps in a hallway. Part of her wanted to be grateful. Another part, the quieter and more bruised part, knew that a single act of defense could not restore what a year of absence had taught her to survive. Your Grace, Mr. Clark said, bowing to Harrison first, then to Grace with a reluctance almost too polished to name. Harrison did not miss it. You will address my wife with the same respect you give me. Mr. Clark's mouth tightened. Of course, Your Grace. Grace sat because her knees had gone strangely light beneath her skirts. Harrison remained standing. Begin with the October storm funds. Mr. Clark opened the first ledger. The lower cottages requested materials in excess of reasonable need. Several roofs were described as urgent, though my inspection suggested delays would not endanger the families. Grace set her folder on the table. You inspected them from the carriage road. The manager blinked. I beg your pardon? You did not walk down to the shore path because the mud was too deep. Mrs. Martin carried her youngest child through 3 rooms with pots on the floor to catch the leaks. Mr. Bellamy's chimney cracked in the storm, and the Alden sisters slept in the pantry for 4 nights because the upstairs ceiling was unsafe. Her voice did not rise. That made the room listen harder. I have their receipts. I have the carpenter's notes. I have the dates your office marked as postponed. Harrison looked at the papers she drew from her folder. There were dozens, each labeled in her careful hand. Names. Costs. Distances from the main house. 3 miles. 4.5. 7, near the old lighthouse road. Grace had not guessed. She had gone. In winter. Across frozen paths he had not thought about in years. Mr. Clark gave a faint laugh. Your compassion does you credit, Duchess, but estate work requires discipline, not sentiment. Harrison moved then, only 1 step, but it was enough to cut the laugh from the room. Discipline is not the same as neglect. Mr. Clark's face paled. Grace turned a page. There is more. The words were soft. Too soft. Harrison looked at her and saw that she was not enjoying this. She was bracing herself, as if truth itself were a cold door she had to open with bare hands. She laid 3 invoices on the table. The lumber billed for the lower cottages was never delivered. The same vendor charged the estate for repairs to the South Pier, but the harbor master told me the pier has not been touched since August. Coal purchase for the widow's allotment was recorded at twice the market rate. Mr. Clark straightened. These are serious accusations. They are serious records, Grace replied. Accusation implies uncertainty. For the first time, Harrison heard steel in her. Not anger. Not pride. Something steadier. A woman who had been dismissed for so long that she had learned to build her authority out of facts no one could mock. Harrison opened one of the ledgers, scanning the columns, then the receipts, then the altered dates. Shame settled over him with a weight colder than the rain outside. This had happened beneath his roof, under his seal, while he had spent months congratulating himself for being dutiful. He had managed ships, contracts, lawyers, and inheritance disputes, but he had not seen the woman preserving his people from the consequences of his indifference. How long have you known? He asked Grace. She did not look at him. Since November. Why did you not come to me? The question left his mouth before he understood its cruelty. Grace looked up then, and the answer was in her eyes before she spoke it. I did. Silence entered the library like another person. Harrison remembered a stack of household notes on his desk in late November, remembered signing instructions at midnight, remembered telling his secretary not to trouble him with domestic complaints. Domestic complaints. The phrase returned to him now like a verdict. Mr. Clark seized the pause. Your Grace, surely you understand that the Duchess may have misunderstood routine accounting. No, Harrison said. He closed the ledger. I understand perfectly. The estate manager swallowed. Then you will allow me to clarify? You will leave Briarfall Hall by evening. Your final wages will be calculated honestly, which is more courtesy than you extended to this estate. Mr. Clark opened his mouth, thought better of it, bowed, and gathered nothing. Harrison rang for a footman and ordered the ledgers secured. When the door closed behind the disgraced manager, the library seemed to exhale. Grace remained seated, her hands folded so tightly that the knuckles had whitened. Harrison wanted to say many things. That he was sorry. That he should have listened. That she had been alone in work that should have been shared. But apology, he was learning, could become another burden if offered before it was earned. You protected them, he said instead. Grace's gaze drifted toward the rain-streaked windows. Someone had to. The sentence was not meant to wound him. It did anyway. Harrison walked to the table and stopped at a respectful distance, near enough for honesty, not near enough to demand comfort. From this morning forward, every household account and estate relief decision will come through you as well as me. She looked startled. That is not necessary. It is overdue. Grace touched the edge of the nearest receipt. Her voice, when it came, was quiet enough to be mistaken for the weather. I did not do it to be rewarded. I know. And he did know. That was what humbled him most. She had not served Briarfall in order to be seen. She had served it because love, in her hands, had always looked like duty performed in silence. Outside, the rain began to thin over Cape Alder, and a pale line of light opened beyond the cliffs. Harrison watched it touch Grace's face and understood with a force that frightened him that the house had not been waiting for him to save it. It had been waiting for him to notice the woman who already had. By the end of that week, Briarfall Hall no longer moved around Grace as if she were a guest whose luggage had been left by mistake. The change was small at first. A footman waited for her answer before carrying messages to the harbor office. Mrs. Bell brought the household keys to her each morning instead of leaving them beside Harrison's plate. The carpenter from the lower cottages removed his cap when she entered the yard and told her his wife said the repaired roof had kept the children dry through the night. Grace accepted each courtesy with careful calm, but Harrison saw what others did not. He saw the way she hesitated before trusting respect. He saw how quickly her eyes lowered after anyone praised her. A year of being tolerated had taught her not to lean too hard on kindness, in case it disappeared. The knowledge followed him through his days with a persistence no business could quiet. On Friday afternoon, when the clouds finally broke and sunlight came pale and cold over Cape Alder, Harrison found himself walking toward the East Conservatory again. He told no one. The corridors smelled of beeswax and winter wool. At the glass door he paused. Inside, Grace stood beneath the repaired roof panes with a watering can in one hand, her sleeves neatly pinned, the warmer shawl folded over a chair as before. The white rose bushes had not bloomed yet, but their leaves looked stronger, bright against the dark soil. She was speaking softly to Mrs. Bell about seed orders for spring, her voice lighter than he had heard it in months. Then she laughed. It was not a grand sound. Not careless. Only a brief, surprised breath of amusement, gone almost as soon as it came. Yet Harrison stood still as if the whole sea had gone silent. He realized he had never heard his wife laugh. Not once in a year. He had lived under the same roof, dined across from her, passed her in halls, watched her curtsy beneath chandeliers and endure society with perfect composure, but he had never known the shape of her laughter. That absence seemed suddenly unforgivable. Mrs. Bell noticed him first and curtsied. Grace turned, and the laughter vanished from her face as swiftly as a candle snuffed by fingers. Harrison hated himself for being the reason the room cooled. "Please do not stop on my account," he said. Grace's expression became polite. "We were only discussing spring plantings." "Then continue." But Mrs. Bell, wise in the way of women who had kept households through sorrow and scandal alike, murmured something about inventory and left them alone among the lemon trees and sleeping roses. Grace set the watering can down. "Was there something you needed, Your Grace?" Harrison looked at the shawl, the roses, the narrow gold ring on her finger, and then at the guarded stillness of her face. "Yes," he said. "But I am not certain I have the right to ask for it." That unsettled her more than command would have. "What is it?" "Your opinion." Grace blinked once. "On what matter?" "The spring reception." He drew a folded note from his coat. "Lady Maribel Crane has written to suggest we host the county families next month. She implies that refusing would confirm every rumor that Briar Fall has become unsociable." A faint shadow crossed Grace's face at Maribel's name. Harrison saw it. He remembered the winter supper. A wife must be very patient when she has nothing else to offer. He had heard it then and let silence sit beside cruelty. "I will decline if you wish," he said. Grace looked toward the wet glass, beyond which the cliffs fell away toward the Atlantic. That would only give her another story. "Then we host it?" "Not as she expects." The answer came so naturally that Harrison almost smiled again. Grace touched one leaf of the nearest rose bush, thinking. "Invite the county families, yes. But also the harbor master, the schoolmistress, the minister's wife, and the families who work the lower shore. Make it an afternoon gathering, not a formal dinner. Open the conservatory. Let them see the house living, not posing." Harrison studied her in quiet astonishment. "Society will call that unusual." "Society calls anything unusual when it includes people they usually ignore." The words were gentle, but they carried the same steel he had heard in the library. Harrison felt something within him yield, not in defeat, but in recognition. "Then that is what we shall do." Grace turned to him, surprised again by agreement. He wondered how many times he would have to say yes before she stopped preparing herself for no. The reception took place 2 weeks later beneath a sky scrubbed clean by ocean wind. Briar Fall Hall opened its doors from the front steps to the East Conservatory, where white cloths covered long tables and bowls of early spring flowers stood among polished silver. The wealthy families arrived first in carriages, wrapped in velvet and curiosity. The Harbor families came later, uncertain at the threshold until Grace herself welcomed them with such quiet dignity that hesitation became gratitude. Harrison watched from near the library doors as she moved among them, remembering names, asking after children, placing an elderly fisherman near the warmest window without making him feel pitied. She did not shine like women who demanded attention. She steadied the room until attention came to her willingly. Then Lady Maribel Crane arrived in pale lavender silk, smiling as if kindness were a game she had already decided to win. "My dear Duchess," she said loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. "How brave of you to make the house so accessible. One almost forgets where society ends and charity begins." The air tightened. Grace's face remained calm, but Harrison saw the familiar flicker in her eyes, the small inward step of someone preparing to endure. Not this time. Harrison crossed the room. Conversations thinned around him. He stopped beside Grace, close enough that the sleeve of his coat nearly brushed hers, though he did not touch her without permission. "Lady Maribel," he said, his voice even, "Briarfall does not measure worth by the distance between a person's name and the shoreline." Maribel's smile faltered. Harrison continued, not loudly, but with the kind of quiet that made everyone listen. "My wife understands this house better than anyone who merely visits it. If today feels unfamiliar to you, perhaps it is because Grace has restored something here that we had forgotten how to honor." Grace looked up at him then, and for one breath the crowded conservatory disappeared. There was surprise in her eyes, but also pain, because public defense could not erase private loneliness. Harrison understood. He was not asking it to. Maribel murmured a brittle compliment, and withdrew toward the tea table. Slowly, conversation returned. Grace faced the guests again, composed as ever, but her fingers trembled once at her side. Harrison saw. He reached down, stopped just short of taking her hand, and opened his palm between them. An offer. Not a claim. Grace looked at it for a long moment. Then, quietly, she placed her gloved hand in his. The contact was light, proper, almost nothing. Yet Harrison felt it like absolution withheld, not granted, and therefore precious. Across the conservatory, the white rose bushes stood beneath the winter-bright glass, their first buds still closed, waiting for warmth they could trust. The touch lasted less than a minute, yet it changed the weather inside Briarfall Hall. Grace withdrew her hand as soon as courtesy allowed, returning to the guests with her usual composure, but Harrison carried the memory of her gloved fingers long after the final carriage rolled away from the front steps. He did not mistake it for forgiveness. He had begun, painfully, to understand that forgiveness was not a door a man could push open because regret had made him impatient. It was a garden, and he had spent a year salting the soil. That evening, the conservatory stood empty except for the faint scent of tea, lemon leaves, and damp wool left behind by visitors. The white rose buds remained closed beneath the glass roof, each one folded tightly around its own small secret. Harrison found Grace there just after dusk, gathering cups from a side table before the maids could return. She had removed her gloves. A red mark circled one finger where the seam had pressed too long. "You should let the staff do that," he said from the doorway. Grace did not startle this time. "They have been on their feet since morning." "So have you?" She lifted one cup into a tray. "I am accustomed to it." The answer was simple. That was what made it difficult to bear. Harrison stepped into the room, the glass panes above him darkening as evening settled over Cape Alder. Beyond the conservatory, the Atlantic breathed in long black waves against the rocks. "You did well today," he said. Grace's hands paused, then continued. "The household did well." "You did well," he repeated. She looked at him then, and the candle on the table cast a small flame in each of her eyes. Praise is a dangerous thing when it arrives after hunger. One is tempted to eat too quickly. The words were not bitter. They were careful, and caution wounded him more deeply than anger would have. Harrison lowered his gaze. "Then I will not ask you to trust it quickly." Grace set the final cup down. "That would be wise." A year ago, he would have found such honesty impertinent. Now he heard it as mercy. She was telling him where the wound was without asking him to heal it by force. A footman appeared at the door with a sealed envelope on a silver tray. For Her Grace. It arrived with the late post. Grace took it, and Harrison recognized the crest before she turned it over. Ellison. Her family. The name seemed to pull a shadow across her face. Thank you, she said. The footman withdrew. Harrison made no move to leave, though he knew he should grant her privacy. Grace broke the seal with a small ivory opener and read by candlelight. With each line, the stillness in her changed. Not dramatically. Grace was not a woman given to collapse. But her shoulders drew inward, and her mouth lost color. Is something wrong? Harrison asked. She folded the letter once. Twice. My aunt in Vermont is ill. She asks that I come as soon as possible. Then we will arrange the carriage tomorrow morning. Grace looked down at the letter. She also writes that my cousin has found a position for me there, should I wish to remain for a time. The conservatory became very quiet. Harrison heard the soft drip of water from a repaired pane into the copper basin below. Remain, he repeated. Away from Briar Fall? Yes. The word was barely more than breath. He should have answered with dignity. He should have said that of course she might visit her family, that Briar Fall would make every arrangement, that a husband who had denied comfort had no right to question escape. Instead, fear moved through him, swift and unfamiliar. Is that what you want? Grace did not look at him. Wanting has not been a useful habit for me. Grace. Her name left him rougher than he intended. She closed her eyes for 1 second, as if the sound had reached a place she had been trying to protect. Please do not make this harder by being kind now. The words struck cleanly. Harrison took 1 step back. Not away from her, but away from the selfish urge to stop her simply because he had finally begun to see her. Grace opened the letter again, though he doubted she was reading it. When I first came here, I thought endurance would become affection if I was patient enough. Then I thought duty would be enough. Then I learned to ask for nothing, and that was easier than hoping. And now? He asked. She folded the letter with great care and held it against her waist. Now I do not know who I am in this house when you are not resenting me. The sentence moved through him like a bell tolling in fog. Harrison had imagined his resentment as distance, a private bitterness he carried without consequence. But it had become the architecture of her life. It had told her where to stand, when to speak, how little to expect, how softly to suffer. If he removed it too suddenly, even kindness became another kind of uncertainty. Outside, wind pressed against the glass. The first rain of a new storm began to tap overhead. Grace glanced toward the white rose bushes. One bud had begun to loosen, not open, not yet, but the outer petal had lifted as if listening for spring. I will leave after Sunday service, she said. Only for a visit at first. At first. Harrison bowed his head because pride had no place left to stand. I will not prevent you. Her eyes lifted to his, and he saw the hurt there, not because she wanted to be held by command, but because some hidden part of her had perhaps wished to be asked to stay with love. He understood too late. Always too late. But if you go, he continued, his voice low, I will use the time as I should have used the past year. I will learn what this house owes you. I will repair what I can without asking you to watch me do it. And if you return, Grace, it will not be to the same cold arrangement you left behind. She studied him for a long moment. Words are beautiful in candlelight, Harrison. It was the first time she had spoken his name without accident or fear. The sound nearly undid him. Mourning is less forgiving. He accepted the judgment because it was true. Grace moved toward the door with the letter in her hand, the white shawl brushing softly against her skirt. As she passed him, he did not reach for her. He only stepped aside. A year of taking her presence for granted had led to this. The noblest thing he could offer was room to leave. When the door closed behind her, Harrison remained alone among the roses, listening to the rain gather strength over Briar Fall Hall, and understood that love had not awakened in him as a claim. It had awakened as terror that freedom might finally teach her how little she needed him. Sunday came under a sky the color of pewter, with rain suspended in the clouds but not yet falling. Briar Fall Hall woke earlier than usual, though no bell announced the reason. Servants moved softly through corridors, trunks were brought down from the east wing, and the carriage lamps were polished before breakfast. Grace had packed only one traveling case for Vermont, as if leaving lightly might make the departure feel less like a verdict. Harrison watched from the upper landing as Mrs. Bell folded a wool blanket over the seat inside the carriage and placed a tin of tea biscuits beside it. Such small preparations. Such ordinary tenderness. He wondered how many acts of care Grace had performed for others while receiving so little in return that even a blanket now seemed almost ceremonial. He had not gone to her rooms. He had not asked again whether she meant to come back. The question would have been a chain if fear spoke louder than love, and he refused, at last, to mistake possession for devotion. Instead, he spent the morning in the Western study with every account book open before him. Not estate figures this time. Her notes. Her receipts. Her letters to tradesmen. Her careful lists of children needing schoolbooks, widows needing coal, roof repairs measured in feet, food stores measured in pounds, lives recorded in margins his former manager had dismissed as sentiment. By noon, Harrison understood what Grace had done. By 2 o'clock, he understood what he had failed to do. By 4, he found the small wooden box at the back of the secretary desk in the east sitting room. He had been searching for household correspondence regarding her aunt's address, nothing more. The box was plain cedar, tied with blue ribbon faded almost gray. It should have remained untouched. He knew that. Yet on the lid, in Grace's hand, was written one line, "Letters never sent, because silence was safer." Harrison stood for a long time with his fingers resting on the ribbon. Then he opened it. The first letter was dated 3 weeks after their wedding. Harrison, today I learned which window catches the sunrise first. It is the one near your mother's portrait. I thought you might like to know, but I do not wish to disturb you. The second was from May. Harrison, the east glass room could live again. I think grief should have somewhere gentle to sit. The third was from the night of the winter supper. Harrison, I was ashamed tonight, though I try not to show it. I do not blame you for silence. Perhaps you did not hear. The fourth was shorter than all the rest. Harrison, I hope someday someone speaks to you with such kindness that you stop expecting injury. He sat down because his legs would not hold him with dignity. The room blurred, not with tears he allowed to fall, but with the fierce restraint of a man discovering that he had been loved in a language he never bothered to learn. Each letter was modest. That made them devastating. She had not asked for jewels, declarations, apology, or passion. She had wanted to tell him about sunrise. About roses. About a roof repaired before a child's bed became wet with rain. She had wanted to share the small evidence of life continuing inside a house he had treated as a mausoleum. Evening service was held in the small chapel because the road to the village church had turned slick with coastal mist. The household gathered in rows, servants behind family, candles trembling beneath the silver cross. Grace sat near the aisle in a dark traveling dress, her bonnet beside her, her gloved hands folded over the prayer book in her lap. Harrison sat across from her, close enough to see the pale mark on her finger where her ring rested, far enough to honor the distance she had earned. The minister read about mercy. Harrison heard only Grace's earlier prayer. Let him be happy. Let him be loved properly. Let me not become the chain. When the service ended, the household withdrew with the quiet tact of people who understood that some farewells require witnesses only from heaven. Grace remained kneeling. Harrison should have left her to that privacy, as he should have done the first night he heard her. But this time, she knew he was there. She did not turn when she spoke. The carriage is ready? Yes. His voice sounded unsteady in the chapel air. Mrs. Bell has prepared everything. She is kind. She loves you. Grace lowered her head. That is a generous word. It is the true one. Silence gathered between them, filled with candle smoke and the distant voice of the sea. Harrison stepped forward only as far as the first row of pews. "I found the letters." Grace went still. The words had been a confession, but he saw that they had landed as exposure. "You read them?" she asked. Her voice was calm. Too calm. "Yes. They were not meant to accuse you." "I know. They were not meant to be seen at all." "I know that too." Grace rose slowly, turning toward him with a face pale from dignity. "Then why read them?" Harrison bowed his head. "Because I have been selfish even in repentance. I wanted to understand what I had done, and instead I found what you had protected." Her eyes shone, but she did not cry. "I protected myself." "No," he said softly. "You protected the part of you that still knew how to love." The chapel candles bent in a draft from the corridor. For a moment neither moved. Then Grace looked toward the altar, and her voice dropped almost to a whisper. "I prayed for you because anger was too heavy to carry. I prayed for your happiness because I could not survive wishing you misery. That does not mean I was happy." The truth entered him cleanly, without ornament. Harrison took it as a man should receive a gift he did not deserve. "I know. Do you?" She faced him fully then, and the wound in her eyes was no longer hidden. "I was your wife in every room where society could see me, and a stranger everywhere else. I learned the sound of your steps so I could leave a hallway before you entered. I learned which flowers reminded you of your mother because you would not tell me what hurt. I learned to pray quietly because hope made too much noise." Harrison could not defend himself. There was nothing in him that wanted to. He walked forward and stopped several feet away, leaving space enough for refusal. "Grace," he said, "I do not ask you to stay because I am afraid of being alone. I ask you to believe that if you return, you will not have to disappear in order to be loved." Her breath trembled once. Outside, the first rain began again, touching the chapel windows like fingertips. Grace looked at him for a long time, then down at the prayer book in her hands. "Beautiful words," she whispered. "And morning is less forgiving." "Then judge me by morning," Harrison said. "By every morning after this one." Morning came without forgiveness, but it came with light. It entered Briar Fall Hall slowly, first as a pale line over the Atlantic, then as a wash of silver across the chapel windows, touching the candles burned low from the night before. Grace did not leave at dawn. She stood in the entrance hall with her traveling case beside her, her dark bonnet tied beneath her chin, while rainwater threaded down the glass panels of the front doors. The carriage waited outside, its wheels dark with mud, the horses shifting gently in the cold. Mrs. Bell stood near the stair with red eyes she pretended were caused by the weather. Harrison came down from the western wing carrying no argument, no demand, no proud husband's claim. In his hand was a folded paper. Grace watched him approach with the careful stillness of a woman who had learned that hope must be examined before it was trusted. "The road to Vermont is nearly 200 miles, he said. "The driver has fresh blankets, and the first stop is arranged at the inn in Augusta. I rode ahead so the rooms will be warm." Grace looked at the paper. "You made arrangements?" "Yes." His voice was quiet. "Not to persuade you. To make certain you are safe whether or not you choose to return." Something moved across her face then, fragile and almost invisible. It was not relief. Not yet. It was the pain of being cared for in a way she no longer knew how to receive. "Thank you," she said. Harrison bowed his head, accepting the smallness of the words because he deserved no larger gift. "There is one more thing." He placed the folded paper on the table near her glove, then stepped back so she could take it without feeling cornered. Grace unfolded it. Inside were not vows, not poetry, not the dramatic promises men make when they fear losing what they have failed to cherish. It was a list, written in Harrison's hand. The East Wing rooms to be warmed daily. The conservatory funds restored to Grace's household account. The lower cottage repairs completed before the next storm. The schoolroom at the harbor opened by spring. Mrs. Bell's authority increased. Every letter addressed to the Duchess of Briar Fall delivered directly to her, unopened and unanswered by anyone else. At the bottom, one final line: "My wife is not to be protected from knowledge. She is to be honored with trust." Grace read it once. Then again. Her lashes lowered, and for a moment Harrison thought she would say nothing. But her gloved fingers tightened around the paper. "This is not an apology," she whispered. "No," he said. "An apology is only the beginning. This is what should have happened before I asked you to believe me." Outside, the rain softened. Somewhere deep in the house, a clock struck 7. Grace looked toward the carriage, toward the road bending away from Briar Fall and into the wet pines. Freedom waited there, not cruelly, not kindly, simply open. Harrison understood that he could not be the man he wished to become unless she was free to choose him, and perhaps not choose him at all. "I will still go," she said at last. The words entered him, but did not destroy him. "I know." Her eyes lifted. "My aunt is ill. And I need to remember myself somewhere. Your sorrow is not in every wall." "Then remember," he said, though the sentence hurt. "Take every day you need." The carriage door opened. Mrs. Bell covered her mouth with her hand. Grace crossed the hall, then stopped at the threshold and turned back. Harrison stood beneath the staircase, straight and pale, looking at her as if love had made him both poorer and more honest. She touched the folded list in her pocket. "When I return," she said softly, "I will not come back as the woman who learned to vanish." Harrison's breath left him in silence. "No," he answered. "You will come back to a house that has learned to make room." Grace stepped into the carriage, and Briar Fall watched her go. For 3 weeks, the house lived by morning. Harrison rose early. He attended every meeting Grace would have attended. He walked the lower shore road himself, 3 miles through wind sharp enough to sting his eyes, and stood inside cottages where repaired roofs held against rain. He opened the harbor schoolroom and placed Grace's name above the door, not as charity, but as truth. He read his mother's journals in the conservatory, and did not close them when grief arrived. Each evening, he wrote Grace 1 page. Not pleading. Not excusing. Only honest. Today the first rose opened. Today Mrs. Martin sent bread and thanks for the roof. Today I almost gave an order without listening, then stopped. Today the house was quiet, but not empty, because I understood you had taught it how to wait. He sent none of the letters unless Grace asked. He placed them in a cedar box beside hers. Silence, this time, was not neglect. It was patience. On the 22nd morning, a carriage appeared on the cliff road beneath a sky washed clean after rain. Harrison saw it from the conservatory, where the white roses had opened in full at last, soft against the glass like small lanterns. He did not run. He wanted to. Instead, he went to the entrance hall and waited with both hands empty. Grace entered wearing a dark traveling cloak, her face tired from the road, her eyes clearer than when she had left. Behind her, cold sea air swept into the hall, carrying the scent of pine, rain, and distant salt. Mrs. Bell wept openly this time. Grace smiled at her first, then looked at Harrison. No curtsy. No title. Only his name, spoken quietly. Harrison. He bowed his head, not as a duke receiving his wife, but as a man receiving mercy. Grace. She glanced beyond him, toward the open doors of the east corridor, where sunlight reached farther than it used to. The house feels different. It is trying to be. And you? He did not answer quickly. I am trying to be worthy of living in it with you. Grace's eyes softened, but she did not rush toward him. That was right. Love rebuilt too quickly becomes another fragile performance. She removed her gloves one finger at a time and placed them on the hall table beside his folded letters, which he had left there for her to find if she wished. Then she extended her bare hand. Harrison looked at it as if it were the first honest gift he had ever been offered. He took it gently, with no claim beyond gratitude. Her hand was warm. In the conservatory that afternoon, Grace read the letters he had written and sent none of them back. Harrison sat across from her beneath the white roses, saying little, learning that presence could be a language when pride no longer interrupted it. When evening fell, they walked together to the chapel. 3 candles waited before the altar. Grace lit one for the house. Harrison lit one for forgiveness still becoming. Together they lit the third for happiness, no longer prayed for at a distance, but tended carefully between them. And Briar Fall Hall, which had once been a mansion of locked rooms and unsaid grief, held the small golden light as if it had finally remembered how to breathe. Some hearts do not awaken when love demands to be seen. Some awaken when they discover they were blessed in silence, and spend the rest of their lives answering that blessing with gentleness.